So our next topic would be about IP strategy. In this part, we are going to talk about the strategy in general. What does it mean? What is it historically? What its historical meaning, where it comes historically, and how we came to that what we call today IP strategy, where is actually the link between IP, as we heard before, and the strategy in a business environment. In fact, we are going to talk about new ways, somehow the new ways of IP strategy, and we may be able to explain the success factors when it comes to IP strategy. So let's ask ourselves first, what is strategy? So before talking about IP strategy, we know what is IP now. The question shall be, what is strategy? Where is strategy is the strategy coming from? How we came to something like strategy? How we came to such a phenomena like strategy, and when we really needed it? So let's go back in time in the old history and think about where did it came, where did it historically came to the first strategic thinking of human beings. Of course, one would say maybe actually the first time human being went out to go for to hunt, let's say, a mammoth. That was the first time they needed a strategy. They had actually to arrange themselves in order to win against that big animal. So their strategies were maybe even too successful because they succeed somehow to eradicate the mammoth. And that is maybe not actually what they wanted, because afterwards you did not have anything to eat. So that is another outcome of the strategy. So what comes out of the strategy? But we are not talking about that. We are talking about actually maybe the very first time that the strategic thinking was very important, and at the same time it was also very important to somehow to document it. So where or which phenomena can we talk about? We are talking about strategic thinking and documentation. And it is a shaming to say, but it is like that. The very first strategic thinking documented we have are from, yes, wars. Wars in different, let's say, eras, years, and countries, but that were wars. It is not maybe that astonishing why wars became the very, very first place where people had to think strategically. It is maybe because this situation is actually the situation where strategy is quite important, where you have some limitations, let's say geographical limitations. You're in a field, a battlefield, and you might know the field or not, and you have a certain number of soldiers out there. So you have some sort of, let's say, restricted resources with which you want to overcome a difficulty. So that is what is war about. So uh, being very ashaming on the one side, on the other side, it's maybe understandable why these strategic thinking came from wars. The big warriors like Alexander the Great or Napoleon, for example, in Europe, they all had their success due to the strategic way of, let's say, conducting the battles. So even one of the very first, let's say, strategic games in the history of the mankind is somehow dealing with that. This game, you know all, maybe is coming somehow from where I'm actually issued from let's say Middle East, India, Iran, and that is, yes, that is chess. I don't want to diminish the value of other strategic games coming from other countries, from Far East countries like Go and so on. But one of the most known is, of course, chess. And even that game is about war. You have a battlefield. The outcome is less bloody. People are not dying during the game. That is actually the good news. But it is about a battlefield, a war between two parties. So these notion of battlefield war, at least competition, is the notion that we can take out of it. Another notion we have to take out of this historical view is that the whole strategic thinking is coming from a situation with some resources which are at your disposal. You will see why I'm talking about all that and why I am trying to emphasize those words. So, uh, on the other side, it is, of course, about thinking, strategic, and on. Uh, some other institution became also more and more important. So, everything started at the beginning with some small stores somewhere in the world. All over the world was like that. People had their own businesses. It is a small family business. And over the years, actually, people were living quite happily with that. So it was actually, you had on the one side an owner who was in charge of everything. He was in charge of the family business. Some of the family members was working for him, and the whole thing was actually a small entity of business. Then it came actually to the industrial revolution, and in fact, these companies got bigger and bigger. And with the growth of the company, it came to another entity, which is actually the enterprises, companies, and so on, which was not that easy to manage just by one person, as it was the case in the small family business. So we had the situation that we had on the first part, the owner, and these owner was owner and manager at the same time, so he took all the risks. Now the companies were growing, so people were working there, and you needed, in fact, to somehow distribute that task into two institutions. So you had now the owner on the one side, and of course the manager on the other side. So what is the manager, or what is management? Management is, in fact, the institution that makes the business for the owner. So they were in charge, in fact, to do the business part, to manage these all these working people together. So at the end, you I mean, the owner could have benefit from uh, their let's say from their company. Okay, so but the question is actually, yes, the companies were bigger and bigger. Why all of a sudden the management became necessary? I mean, just because things are bigger, that does not mean, in fact, that we need to have a manager. Why was management all of a sudden necessary by the growth of companies? The main reason is, in fact, and that is very, I'm very happy to say that the the same reason that we are talking together is the reason that it became necessary. We are human beings and not machines. So if you're machines, you did not need, let's say, some manager for that. The machine is doing what you tell him to do. And a machine does not care about any other aspects. We are not like that. Luckily, we are luckily not like that. We are human beings. And as a human being, what we do is that we communicate. And the possible number of communication ways of connection, relation in a society grows with each member. Let's say if we had just two member, then there were only one, let's say, a communication way. If we go to the case of three members, then we might have three ways of communication, which is still doable. When we are going to the case of four members, then we have six possible way of communication. When we add just one more person, you see the number is growing over proportionally by adding more members. And just think if we had only 100 employees, there are 4,950 relation possibilities between these employees, which makes it almost impossible to do just by saying, okay, let them do that. So you need somehow these management because we are human, because we are people that are connecting together, and each of us uh, has not only these connection with other possible colleagues at the work, but he has his own connections to the family, to other members, to other friends, and so on. So you see that actually people are much more complicated than machines. So up until the day where machines will do everything for us, and I don't know, some sort of artificial intelligence can even think for us, up until that day, we will need at least some institution like management to manage the work or to somehow give an order to the work. So still, I did not talk about what is strategy. The question is, in fact, what is strategy? Let's say we are in a position for the time being. We're in an actual position now. And then in the next step, we would like to be in a future position. So, in fact, in order not to go in lots of directions from actual position to the future position, you might have found several ways to do it. You can go to the upper side of the slide and then go further and then come down and go to the future position and so on and so forth. In order not to be somehow distracted by so many ways that exist to go from one position to the other one, what you need is in fact is a sort of strategic direction. So these strategic direction, what that does is in fact it bundles everything toward one goal, which is the future position. So I think I have somehow given to you an idea what a strategy is. So how to define the strategy? So what do you think? How can we define that strategy? Of course, everybody knows. It is a detailed planning how to go from A to B. Is it correct? Of course not. The strategy is never a detailed planning. It is a sort of unifying leitmotif which gives somehow, let's say, the overall direction so that all the actors know in which direction they can steer. So the idea of strategy is to unify all different directions to a unified way so that everybody is doing the same thing and actually following the same, let's say, the thread, the red thread. So, to see strategy is in fact responsible for the coherence and the steering of the decision acts of a unity. So, whatever this unity is it, for example, an army in the case of a war? No, we are no more actually in a war situation and hope that it lasts a long time. For the time being, we are talking just about business. And when I'm talking about unity, I'm of course talking about a business unit. So uh, let's say a successful strategy shall be in somehow in good coherence with the internal and external environment of the industrial environment. Uh, in fact, uh, the strategy is a sort of link between the company and its environment. And when we are talking about strategic fit, we want to express the idea that exactly this company has this strategy that allows him to somehow be in accordance with the external and with the internal, let's say, environment of that company. So the next question is okay, yeah, now we know the strategy is responsible for the coherence. It unifies our acts. It gives some sort of direction to all the activities of this company. So, how can we have success with that strategy? Nothing easier than that, isn't it? So, what you need is, in fact, to make some proactive, simple, and commonly accepted goals. Then you shall have a good understanding of the competitive environment. So you have to know what in which competitive environment you are, what are the external environments you are competing in, and of course you have an objective assessment of the on resources. You know what are your capabilities. You know good about your resources. What can you do? Once you have all these three factors, then altogether leads you exactly to the successful strategy. Of course, given you have efficiently implemented all these preconditions in order to achieve that successful strategy. As easy as like that, isn't it? Of course not. It is not that easy. I mean, if it was so easy, you could have done it, and everybody could have done it. And if everybody can do it, then there is no successful strategy. So all these, let's say, factors and how to get to successful strategy, it is quite nice when you have it on a slide as I present it to you. But how really to achieve it is the way and in fact a quite difficult situation you experience in your everyday life, and of course also your competitors. So nevertheless, what we want to do is not just to give you what is difficult, what is not difficult, but to introduce you a way how you can do it the best. So that is actually what will be discussed in the coming slides. You might have, first of all, several levels of strategy. So at the beginning, we are trying to distinguish between business and corporate strategy. Let's say corporate strategy is dealing with the question and address the question of the attractiveness of the sector. What is attractiveness of the sector? It is in fact the question, in which industry shall we be in? So that is the corporate strategy. At the head of the corporate, they have to decide in which industrial environment do they want to compete. So that is the question that is addressed by the corporate strategy. On the other side, we have, of course, business strategy. And the business strategy ask the question and try to give an answer to that question uh, of the competitive advantage. So if you address the competitive advantage question, the question shall be, how shall we compete? So corporate strategy answers the question, where shall we compete? And the business strategy, in fact, is the one who wants to give an answer to the question, how can we compete? So, in order, of course, to be successful, it's not just how we want to compete, but how we want to compete to be successful at the end. So, if you look at a hierarchical way how normally the companies are built, you will see that, of course, the corporate strategy is placed somewhere at the corporate head office, where, for example, the business strategy is more or less placed at the level of, let's say, divisions. So division one has a business strategy adapted to, in fact, the business, what Division 1 does. And Division 2 is actually maybe another strategy because this shall be actually adapted to that one. So the corporate head office decides. Division 1 is in fact in this industry environment. Division 2 has to compete in another industrial environment. And then at the head of divisions, these are the people who are deciding about the business strategy, how to compete in that different, let's say, industrial environments. And then we have, of course, other type of strategy that is actually the functional strategy, which applies to each department. For example, research and development, human resources, IPN, and so on and so forth. So these functional strategies, in fact, again, somehow deducted from the business strategy. So the corporate strategy will somehow define what would be the business strategy, and then these will help us to define the functional strategy at the level of different departments. So that is how it is normally done, and how it is actually more or less the case in most of the big and even small companies nowadays around the world. So, what are the objectives of strategy? The objectives of strategy are, on the one side, of course, how to earn a competitive advantage. How we define the competitive advantage is that when two or more firms compete within the same market, one firm has a competitive advantage over its competitors when it earns, or at least he has the potential to earn, a persistently higher rate of profit. That is actually why this competitive advantage is defined over other rivals and competitors. So the big question is actually how to earn above all over, let's say, rivals, in the same industry. On the other side, and the other objective of the strategy is, of course, to have above average returns, formally defined as these are returns which are above average market return. We have actually returns which are somehow higher and what you in average can earn in that market. These can only be realized, of course, to maximize the profit. So that is the basis of the objectives of the strategy, to earn competitive advantages and to have above average returns. So all what we are talking about from now on is actually in order to achieve those both goals. So what is strategy management? Strategy management is a science that explains the performance of or the difference between the performances between different competitors and how the companies shall be managed to maximize their profits. So, in fact, one question is actually how to manage and develop competitive advantages. And then the other question is actually how to exploit competitive advantages to realize the above average returns we talked about. So both these questions will be addressed within the science of strategy management. You have two basic approaches of strategic management, the so-called market-based view, and of course, the other one is actually the resource-based view. So let's talk about first market-based view, and then we are going to talk about resource-based views. These both approaches try, in fact, to somehow to explain why do we see that different competitors on the same market are performing differently. Uh, and as the name are indicating, they are not exactly the same way of thinking. One of them is, in fact, is putting in the middle of our attention the market, what is outside the company, and the other one is concentrating on the capacities of the or capabilities of the company itself, which is the resource-based view. So uh, just before starting that and before actually we talk about those two tools to distinguish between performances, let's take a look at what is the reality in the market. First of all, let's take a look at the shares of profitful in different industries. Uh, you can actually easily see here that different actors which are competing on the same, let's say, industry. Here is, for example, the US car industry. They don't have the same share on the one side, but they don't have also the same rate of profit. And it is not the one who has actually the bigger shares that have also the higher rates. For example, one of the biggest shares are here is in the hand of the used car dealers, and these are the guys who earn the least in the whole industry. On the other side, leasing is also another actor on the on that industry, and the leasing, let's say, actors are having a quite high rate of profit, more than 20%, but not having a big share on the whole, let's say, shares of industry. So, as you see, in fact, that is one example for the car industry. The other example, which is quite interesting, is in fact the, let's say, computer and PC industry, the personal computer industry. And you see that, for example, in that PC industry, again, the same things goes away. The one who are, in fact, producing these personal computer, which is at the heart of the whole thing. I mean, if you are in the PC industry exists because there is a PC. And these guys are at the heart of this industry, and they are actually the actors who earn the least, let's say, from this profit pool. Where, for example, other actors like the software producers, or for example, even the most of them is a microprocessor producer, the one all of you are familiar with is, of course, Intel, for example. They have a huge rate of interest at more than 30%. So you see that it is not because the industry is about you that you are in a sector where you can actually earn a higher rate. So that shows, and that brings us to one of the first aspects of the first approach we are talking about, which is market-based view. This approach is based on an assumption. And the assumption is that actually the internal resources of companies have no impact on the results. It is, of course, a huge and false assumption, because we will see that cannot be like that. So a big company has exactly the same situation as a small company in that assumption. But even with that, let's say, very rough assumption, we would see that we can achieve a lot of results to understand why there are differences between different companies which are, let's say, competing on the same side. This theory was somehow developed in late 70s in the United States by Michael Porter. And Michael Porter said it best, actually. And he said that at broadest level, firm success is a function of two areas. And these two areas are, first of all, the attractiveness of the industry in which the firm competes. And then the second one is, in fact, its relative position within that industry. So, uh, first of all, how attractive is it? It is, in fact, the industry we chose. And then once we are familiar with that, how good are we positioned within that industry? So think about, for example, airplane and aeronautic industry. In that industry, in fact, the companies, their airlines, for example, are under a huge, let's say, pressure, especially in those days that actually all the traffic went out and so on. But these actually actors are the one who earn the least when you are thinking about the whole thing. Again, in the examples we saw just before that, for example, the US car industry, or the example of PC industry, again, it was a question, uh, what is the attractiveness of that industry? And in once you actually decide about that, there are different, let's say, competitors in the same industry and in the same market, and then you have to see how are you positioned, how is actually this company positioned within that market, within that industry. So uh, in fact, Porter tries to explain everything just by these two, let's say, factors. I don't know, about 8 minutes. It is all in all 30 minutes of video, but I would say actually 8 minutes of it, it's quite interesting for you to hear. I would love to share it with you if we were actually in a presentation, but it's not in presence, so I cannot show it via actually this type of media we are using yet. But you have received the documentation and the address is given there. So click on that, let's say, site. And if you have 8 minutes of time, let you be explained by Michael Porter himself. This theory. He's the guy actually who made that theory and who developed that theory. He can actually explain it the best. And I would say actually that's 8 minutes quite good. But in the absence of the possibility to hear what Michael Porter says, I try actually to give in some details what is all this theory about. So Michael Porter says, and the idea of market-based view is explaining the whole industry on by accepting that there is actually five major market forces out there. So the first one is in fact the rivalry inside the industry. Then you have two further forces, which are the bargaining power of suppliers, and on the other side, of course, bargaining power of customers. Then you have two further actually forces, which are the threats of new entrants, and on the other side, the threat of new substitutes. So the thing is intact that everything in this approach is decided and defined and developed due to these five market forces. Now, we shall actually think about these forces and try to find out where we can actually put IP on that. Where is IP coming into that game when you are thinking of that five market forces? So let's say the rivalry inside the industry is on one side. On the other side, of course, actually these threats coming from outside, or the power of bargaining of customer or suppliers. So can IP somehow intervene somewhere? So at the end, strategic use of IP can help us to change the forces in a way that we are the one who have the better cards when we are playing these games. So what do you think? Where can actually IP all over intervene? Yes, you might be right by telling overall. In fact, IP can and shall be involved in all of the aspects where we have. I try somehow now to go step for step to show you wherever you might find the possibility to use IP in a strategic way so that these five forces can be used in the best way for you. So let's start with the case of rivalry inside the industry. Where can you or how can you use IP in order to have these forces on your side? There are some questions you have to answer when you are thinking about the IP rivalry inside the market and IP. One of the main questions is actually, are we protecting our USP, that is actually the unique selling proposition? The unique selling proposition is the thing which makes you different from anybody else. That is the aspect that makes you the one and only where customers are willing to pay. So you shall have a USP if you want to subsist in a market. Then once you have the USB, uh, uh, the question is actually, uh, are we protecting our USB sufficiently? In order to protect that, you need the IP to do that. Uh, for example, in that aspect, what you can do is actually, by using IP, you can make your USB somehow so special that nobody else can afford to somehow to offer the same sort of aspects. Then the other question is actually how to use IP right to gain market shares. On the other side, actually, is the question of enforcement of your own rights. So one thing is, in fact, used IP to gain some market shares. So, in fact, you will be the one who is in place and has most of the share by using your IP. And on the other side, you use actually your enforcement rights in order to make it difficult for your rivals, in fact, to persist on that market. Uh, so you can you can do that only if you use your IP rights in a correct way. For example, you know that IP makes some standardizing. So by use of IP, you set the standard. So once you have the IP, the technology that everybody has to use is actually dependent on your, let's say, on your IP, and that makes it standard. So that standardizing uh, bring it to the point that some let's say competitors that cannot afford it, they go out of the market. And that reduces the variety of actually competitors. Uh, just to show how actually things has been evolved at the beginning of the car industry. There were about 100, I say it, 100 car companies just around the city of Paris. So just around one European capital, which is Paris, you had about 100 different companies. If you look at the whole car industry nowadays, there are, I don't know, five, six, seven big ones, and that is all. So you see that these IP standardization actually brought it to the point that small companies or other companies would not exist anymore. Then what you can use is, in fact, using IP does not mean only to use your patents. One thing you can use is, in fact, is you use the branding, and the branding helps you to win more market share. So a lot of people are buying, for example, I don't know, Apple instruments because they love only these trademark. So for them, it is even not very important that another competitor like Samsung or anything else has even better aspects to offer. It is not a question of offering or not. Even it's not a question of the technology. It is because of the brand. There are people who are eager to buy only Apple, let's say, instruments because of it is Apple, because of the branding. So these branding, these again IP, make that most of people or a lot of people actually are buying their products. Then the branding at the same time somehow increase the cost of advertisement for the competitors. So if you want now to be one of the competitors in the world of smartphone, for example, you have to put a lot of money in advertising so that your name is at least known, even if it is never as known as the one of Apple, iPhone, or for example Samsung. So you see, actually, these two big ones actually changed the whole environment, so that it is nowadays quite difficult to get in that market just by using their brands. So these are actually some aspects you can use in order to make you known to win on the force of rivalry inside the industry. The next one is actually how to uh, 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 how to use IP in order to make a barrier against the threat of new entrants. So again, you have to ask your the right questions. The right question is actually, are IP rights assure, for example, a severe market barrier so that new entrants is not that easy? Or can we apply our technology to a different field? So normally, actually, once you have a technology, that does not mean it is only for these type of market. It might be useful for another market. And these threat for other competitors might actually change their mind to enter into your market. And then, of course, using your IP to enter a new regional market, or using your technology to use in the regional market is actually also another question. Again, what IP can for you is, in fact, by having that IP, you make some close standard so that not everybody can come new in. Then also branding would be a sort of barrier for new incomers. Um, uh, of course, you can even somehow control the distribution channels, distribution channels by using your IP. So you are the one who dictates, you distributor, actually you distribute only my, let's say, products and not the one from the competitors. So even you can use your IP to control the distribution channels, and that makes it quite difficult for new entrants. On the other side, IP give you some let's say power of negotiation, because once you have IP, also in other let's say technological fields, you have the power of negotiation with let's say potential newcomers. And they know, okay, you can do the same to them. So that is again another point which might be very interesting to think of when you are thinking of these force and IP. So now another question is, in fact, how to deal with the threat of new substitutes. New substitutes are, in fact, other products of your competitors that can be used in principle instead of your own products. And that is, again, a lot of questions that shall be asked. And the answer to that question goes over IP, of course. For example, can the product be easily invented around? Are there other solutions that can be protected? Can we use our technology as a substitution for competitors' product? So, in fact, by asking that question, you might have some answers, strategic answers to that. As for example, when you ask yourself, are there other solutions that can be protected? That is, in fact, you are thinking of IP rights as prohibitive rights. So it is not about protecting the solution you need, but the protecting, or in fact prohibiting other people, third party, using their own solutions. So that goes in the direction where I am trying to make you go in when you are thinking of IP strategies. That is, when you are inventing something, of course, what you are normally thinking of is actually how to protect that invention, my own solution. When you are thinking strategically, it is not only how to protect your own solution, but the most important part is actually how to hinder other people maybe offering the same unique selling proposition that I have. And that is where you might even patent solutions which are not your own, but which you know that, for example, your rivals, your competitors are strong at, and they might find these solutions. So you patent the solution in order to make a barrier against them. So uh, they there you have also another answer to that. For example, IP in fact creates monopoly position and enables the companies to temporarily lower prices in order to keep competitors out. So by using your IP, you are the one who is the cheapest. So the substitutes cannot be sold at the same price as yours. Then, of course, the protection of features required by or for the interoperability can increase buyer switching costs. Here, I just give you the example of most of the platforms. That is what the platforms are doing, in fact. So you think about, for example, the music platform, I don't know, from Apple, the iTunes. You buy music there and you think you have paid for the music, it is your music, it belongs to you, but in fact, it belongs somehow not directly to you. As long as you are on iTunes, you can have access, of course, to that music, but you cannot take it so easily and go to another platform even if you paid for that music. So you see, these aspects of interoperability are somehow diminished by use of IP, and that makes it quite difficult to change. That hires somehow the switching cost for the customer, and that is where the IP is actually used strategically. Or, for example, you can use actually the communication function of trademark, and that can influence the perceived level of product differentiation, which means in fact uh, uh, because you know that these trademark, these brand has qualitatively high and innovative products, again, that might even somehow succeed to influence the perception of your customers due to your, let's say, products. And that by its side diminish the threat of a new substitute. Another aspect that you might think of is about actually the bargaining power of the suppliers. So can we do something also by using our IP in order to use that force at the maximum of our benefit? Again, the right questions are, for example, is know-how we transfer to suppliers sufficiently protected? Binding our suppliers to our companies by using the IP, would it be a possibility? Or, for example, could or should we have R&D cooperation with our suppliers, and under which circumstances? Again, these are actually the right questions. And for example, when you think about if your suppliers are somehow bound to your company by your IP, that in fact diminish their power of bargaining. So they need you in order to survive. So that is actually the way the whole strategy goes. Then make sure that you don't transfer your know-how in a manner to your supplier, then at the end, actually, your supplier can do exactly the same thing as you can do. So make sure that your know-how is sufficiently protected before coming to some sort of cooperation. Then again, actually, how to use IP, how the IP can impact on that might be in different ways. For example, IP can increase supplier switching costs by increasing buyer industry concentration. So, in fact, the supplier is somehow dependent on you. He cannot that easily switch to another buyer. Or, for example, IP can affect the concentration of the buyer and supplier industries. We talked about it. We talked about the standardization of IP effect. Then participants in the buyer industry can hold IP in the supplier industry and thereby set conditions with it. So if you are in fact in the buyer industry, you might still have some solutions in the supplier industry, which in fact binds the supplier to you, and they have actually to accept your conditions. Or, for example, the IP protection of value-added steps within the value chain can block backward or forward integration. So you block the possibility that your supplier, which is a very big company, can somehow swallow you by using the IP. Because if your supplier is much bigger than you, the danger is actually quite high that they will integrate you one day by actually your company and make it part of their own corporate. So on the other side, components for branded products can be bought cheap due to trademarks of high value. So that means, in fact, you buy somehow the components much more cheaper than the end product, and that makes a higher margin. Again, that is what we see in for example, in the smartphone, in the whole smartphone industry, where if you see the components are not that expensive as the final product you got. So if you want to buy the newest, I don't know, Samsung, or the newest iPhone, you might pay about $1,000. But if you actually sum up the components they use in order to do that, including the working time and so on and so forth, the real price is at about half of it. So you see, in fact, that is how, again, the IP helps you to win some more force in front of your suppliers. The last question here is about actually the bargaining power of your customers, and that is again very, very central problem, because all in all, what you are doing is somehow to bring that product to your customer, and what you want is, in fact, to bind your customer to yourself. So the questions, again, which are very important, is all the attributes that are important to our customers are sufficiently protected. Uh, you must know that, in fact, the customers, they don't pay for the fact that you patented a solution. They don't pay for even not really for the cost of your trademark and so on and so forth. They pay for a product because this product gives them some, let's say, attributes, some characteristics that they need and they find as somehow acceptable. So if they buy that for that attributes, the point that shall be protected are that attributes, not the solution, not the technical solution, not the technological solution as a patent. So once you in fact want to make your own strategy, that is what it really matters. Think about which are the attributes, which are the characteristics that are important to our customers, and try to protect them. Then, of course, how to tighten the relationship to our customers through IP. I gave you the example of, for example, the platforms. That is a good example how it is done. Or another question is actually, are the customers able to transfer our know-how to our competitors? That can also happen if you are not vigilant, if you are not careful enough. It is not, let's say, that seldom that your solution, your way of doing things, your know-how might be transferred through your customers to your competitors. So make sure that that does not happen. Also, so that you are in a force situation and you cannot be damaged by those type of interaction. Here again, the impact of IP might be quite interesting because, for example, again, IP can increase, for example, uh, the switching cost of your customer. So as I told you, it is by using the platform, the switching cost is so high that you remain with the first platform where you bought your music, because otherwise you will lose all that music. That is not what you want. So, of course, again, IP can increase the bargaining power of the seller. It's quite clear. Uh, IP also can be used for branding strategies in order to make a segment more sophisticated. So by using actually a new line, you try to, in fact, sell not only a product but the whole thing which goes with the product together. Something about luxury, something about actually you want to have it. So there are cars, and the cars they bring you from A to B, and that is what a car doing. In most of the countries, you are not even allowed to go faster than, I don't know, some 100, 200, 120, 103, 30 kilometers per hour. So even having a very fast car is not of use nowadays. However, it is a question of prestige having that brand of car. So that is again, people are willing to have, I don't know, a Porsche or a Maserati or something like that because that is that brand of car. And at the end effect, it is exactly the same car as the other one and does exactly the same thing, but it's not the same feeling. And this same feeling is coming also through branding, of course. That is actually what the whole thing is about. So, market-based view is, in fact, a bit too, let's say, restricted. It talks about these five market forces. However, nowadays at least, we know that it is not completely correct. Maybe at the time, as Michael Porter thought about that theory, it was quite correct. Word was quite easy. Things were much more easier. Nowadays, we know that it is not that easy. You cannot, even in the your industrial, let's say, field, a company cannot hope to offer all pieces in the market. That means that companies not only have to focus on their competitors, but also on their collaborators. So what is really missing as a force in the as a market force here are the complementers. That is the one which also shall be taken into account when we are talking about a thorough market-based view. It's not only the five Porter forces, but nowadays also, of course, the complementers. So what you have to think about is to think about building strategic alliances, and of course that affects the competition within an industry. So the IP relevant questions are here: which IP is attractive to a potential collaborator? Or, for example, which companies are relevant complementors in terms of IP? Or, for example, which IP risks are related to building strategic alliances? So, these IP questions shall be also addressed and answered so that before going further. The goal of Porter's five market forces was, in fact, to know very well the market and to, in fact, to make a good positioning inside that market. That is actually a classical market analysis. And that is done in order to create sort of, let's say, persistent competitive advantage. Uh, in order to get that optimum of positioning, you shall somehow decide. There are not so many ways to achieve that positioning, that higher positioning. You have, in fact, two possibilities. Either it is about the cost leadership, so you are the cheapest one. So that is actually one way of doing that. Or you are achieving that, let's say, optimum of positioning through differentiation. So you differentiate yourself from your competitors in a manner that your unique selling proposition is really unique and people are willing to pay for that. There is actually a third way. It is about niche markets. When you are in a niche market where there are not so much of, let's say, competitors, then you might go for the third strategical way, which is actually focus. Let's put actually the niche market aside and just concentrate on those two possibilities, which is actually cost leadership or differentiation. So these two competitive advantages, these two effects that might bring you to a competitive advantage, uh, uh, is that at the end you will have the persistent higher, let's say, rentability or profit rate. Uh, as you see, it is actually a very simple way of thinking things. It has uh, a huge weakness also. I mean, these tool, which is market-based view, has a huge weakness. Of course, on the one side, it is somehow exaggerating the market perspective. So they say, in fact, market is everything. Market is deciding about everything. And that is, of course, exaggerated. Market is very important, but it is not everything. So these exaggerating aside, there is another problem which can be pointed out when we are thinking about the market-based view. Uh, and that is, in fact, uh, that is a very static concept of competition and market. So, in fact, it says once you have a good positioning and you know your market and your industry and you have the best positioning, so everything is done. It is quite let's say, static, because there is no dynamic in it. You cannot, due to these type of, let's say, perspective, you cannot evolve, you cannot make an evolution. Nobody new can come in, and so on and so forth. And we know that is not correct, because these theory is simply neglecting your own force. And that is why we need to talk about the second perspective, which is resource-based view. What is resource-based view about? So the second IP strategy tool, or the second tool to help us to understand actually IP strategy, possible IP strategy analysis, is the resource-based view. Resource-based view is a theory that explains firm performance on the basis of firms' ability to create, maintain, and renew competitive advantages in terms of the characteristics and dynamics of the internal resources of the company. So in fact, these theory makes another assumption, and the assumption, it assumes that companies are just a bundle of resources having the same market conditions. That is quite similar to what a physicist might do when you are in front of a problem that you cannot solve at the whole. You try to fix some boundaries in order to solve the rest of it. And that is more or less what happens here. That is what the resource-based view does. It says that everybody has the same market condition, and then we try to define how the firm performances can differ from one to another one. So in that case, in fact, it says basically if a company is in a current position, in order to achieve and remain and maintain actually that current position, it needs the current resources. Uh, then the company might decide to achieve another, a further position, which is actually the future position. And in order to achieve that position, you need, of course, further resources, and these are actually the future resources. So nothing easier than that. Just fill in these resource and capability gap, and you can achieve it. So in other words, if you want to be more successful, hire more people. So the more resources you have, the better the situation afterwards. We all know that that is not correct, and that not all the, let's say, differences can only be described by that gap. But as I told you, that is just an approximation in order to understand how it works. So now the point is, in fact, the good thing about that is actually uh, it's quite dynamic, these way of thinking, because it says that you can in fact dynamically change by changing your resources. But before talking about resources, we have to know what we are talking about. What are resources? So there are maybe two different way of talking about resources. One might talk about resources in the broader sense, or about the resources in the narrower sense. When we are talking about resources in the narrower sense, we are talking about resources that somehow, um, let's say, involve all tangible assets, your human capital, the organizational capital, your technology, your know-how, the firm culture, the financial assets, reputation, etc. So that is actually what we are normally talking about when we are talking about resources. We might also talk about resources in broader sense. And when we are talking about resources in the broader sense, we are talking about the organizational routines and about the technical competences. These organizational routines and technical competences are mostly known under the notion of core competences. So, what is a core competence? The core competence is something that, in fact, make you what you are from outside. Your, let's say, customer might know you and might deal with you because of your core competences. The core competences lead to extraordinary value perception for the customer. So, in fact, for example, if you are very well established as a company in innovation, let's say, environment, and you are known as an innovative company, that is how people would perceive you. Would actually perceive you. The value of your company is perceived by your customer as an innovative company, and that is uh, part of your core competence. It allows for superior performance ability compared to competitors. So, in fact, your core competence, what makes you so special regarding to your competitors. It is a competence with sustained effect and value creation for the achievement of strategic company goals. And that is actually another very important aspect of a core competence is that can be used and deployed with numerous products and markets of a company. So normally your core competence gives you these multiple use possibility. So uh, these perception these value perception, these let's say a variety of usage, these competences give you the possibility to achieve your goals and actually to have higher performance compared to your competitors. Exactly, these are the points you want somehow to make it available only for you. So uh, the goal of resource-based view is, in fact, to make your resource as an asset for sustainable and competitive advantage. Uh, that means, in fact, it is only possible if your resources have four special characteristics. Uh, First of all, they shall be valuable. Second, they shall be rare so that not everybody can access that. Then it shall not be imitable, it shall be imperfectly imitable, and it shall, in fact, be non substitutable. So uh, we call that you shall make your resources VRIN. VRIN, VRIN. These are the abbreviation of these four characteristics: valuable, rare, imperfectly imitable, and non-substitutable. So let's say the goal of a resource-based view is in fact to make your resources VRIN. How to do it is in fact just by seeing resource as a strategic value. Uh, while these resources and capabilities are your strategic asset, in order to make them VRIN, you have to again make sure that these are in fact somehow uh, done with your IP, and that is again where the IP comes into our game. I don't want, in fact, to go over all details again here, but the point is, in fact, while thinking of your resources, you have to think about the scarcity of the resources, the tradability or the value proposition of that resources, about durability of the resources, the scalability, also about the appropriability. It means, in fact, how to make an appropriation, how to appropriate the benefits of that resource. And of course, the fact that the resource is inimitable and not substitutable. So all these aspects again involve IP in details. So uh, we are not going to make the whole thing again because it makes too much of time. But I just wanted to mention an example. Now, this example about the substitution and immutability of resources, how different IP functions might help you to make your resources not substitutable and not immutable. So uh, uh, let's think about different IP functions. One of the most known IP functions is, of course, the protection function of IP. Normally, actually, we try to protect our solutions by IP, by patents, by so on and so forth. So these protection function enables a technology lead by protection from imitators. And these technology lead, the technology lead is in fact gives you the possibility to make your resources non-imitable. Then you can use IP as for its blocking functions. It means, in fact, not to protect your solution, but to block other people using their own solution. So, in fact, IP covers future technology spaces where substitutes may emerge. So, what you are basically doing is, in fact, you are thinking in terms of your competitors and of their resources, and you try to block their possibilities to design some substitutes to your resources, so by blocking function of the IP. Another possibility is actually is to use the licensing function of IP. It is also very well known and quite well used aspect of IP functions. So by licensing it, you might create a standard which leads to lock-in effects and inhibits substitutes. So by for example, even there are some examples where people starting the whole technology by, let's say, several years of let's say free license. Why are they doing that? Why are companies like Sony and so on start to patent their solutions and then they give free licenses? The idea behind it is, in fact, to make a standard so everybody uses only these solutions. After several years, you can be sure your solution is now actually so standardized that everybody uses that one. And that creates these lock-in effects. And once you are in there, you cannot go out. You still remain with that solution. And that is the reason why they are using that free license, for example. So, uh, all this has been said. Let's just talk about what is in fact specific about these tool. Uh, um, yes, I would say actually it is what is specific about these, let's say, tool is that you shall know the strategic value of your resource, and you shall try to make it win by recognizing what is the value, what is strategic value. You might have actually the possibility to make it win using IP. You also can create what we call dynamic capabilities. That is the capability of a company. Uh, uh, it's to integrate its own internal and external competences, uh, and to configure that so that it can adapt to a let's say a very fast changing environment. You see that these dynamic capability is becoming more and more important. That is, in fact, very important, especially because the life of many industries and so on are not that long anymore. You know, if you're thinking about actually car industry, we have the car industry since more than 100 years. When you're thinking about PC industry, it is not longer than, let's say, 20, 30 years. And now we are coming somehow to the end of that era. People are not maybe buying big personal computers. Most of the people are working on their laptops, on their smartphones, and so on. So if you are a company in that field, and you don't have the dynamic capability to adapt to these very fast changing environment, uh, you can be sure that you do not survive. A very good example of a company with, for example, with this dynamic capability is Netflix. Maybe some of you know that Netflix was a company started by renting DVDs and CDs over the internet. So all of a sudden, in fact, at that time they were very successful and so on, sending, let's say, the DVDs and CDs by post and so on, mailing it. Then okay, they started, in fact, okay, now people are not asked for sending them the DVD. They don't use the DVD. No, they download it. So started by renting these downloading possibilities of the let's say films and so on, uh, and then now they decided, and that is the dynamic capabilities. They went from the position they had, which is a renting company for DVDs, to a content producing company. Nowadays, Netflix is producing series and contents. So that is, in fact, quite amazing, because that means you have really to change and adapt your internal resources, which you had as a company who sent and mail, let's say, DVDs to another company which creates contents, which creates series or television series, or even actually movie films. So in fact, this capability is what is more and more needed to survive in nowadays competitive environment. And that needs, in fact, a thorough and sound knowledge of your own resources, on your own capabilities, and of course a good adaptation, reaction time and adaptation to the changes. So let's go to one of the last topics our of our series about IP strategy, and that is about the IP integration and business model. But before starting talking about integration, IP integration, and business model, let's first of all try again to define what is a business model. So if you search for the definition of business model, you will find something like that. The business model is a plan how a company makes profit. It describes the rational economic logic behind the creation, delivery, and capturing of value. In other words, uh, the business model describes how the value proposition of the company is communicated and realized. In fact, the business model shall uh, in the first place communicate somehow how you will compete, how you make money if you want, and how that might work in your industrial environment. So now knowing what is a business model and what we are talking about, let's talk about more about how IP can be integrated in the business model itself. So there are several generic IP strategy depending on the sector where you are and depending on business plan, business models people are conducting in those industries. I give you some of the examples so that you might become familiar with them. Some of them are already familiar to you, some maybe a bit less, but all in all is in fact a good, let's say, exercise in order to understand how the IP strategy works. So uh, we have the IP strategy fortress monopoly. That is, in fact, an IP strategy based on large IP portfolios and making high market barriers. And of course, the very important part here is that, in fact, enforcement. So you, in fact, you are in this industry in a situation where your rights is enforced as much as possible, of course. That is mostly the case of pharmaceuticals and chemistry, where people who are involved in those industries, they know that the highest goal is to have a patent on the molecule, and once you have the patent on that molecule, of course you have the strongest patent possible, and then make a blockbuster out of it and then enforce your rights so that nobody else can sell the same molecule. Quite well established industry, in fact. However, a well established industry based on that specificity, which is in fact the molecule and patent on the molecule. Then you have the value added monopoly. That is the case for most of our cases. In fact, we are in the sector, typical sector of consumer goods, automotive, and so on. You are dealing here with mostly more or less complex assembled products, like in automotive or any other part of it. And then here, what is normally done is the protection of user relevant features or making strategic patents in order to hinder competitors to do that. That is the blocking aspect of that. And then, of course, in order to be successful, you shall be fast in documentation and protection. So That is what you also see very often all around actually the industry. Here is in fact a situation where most of the cases industries we have here quite fits quite good for the market-based view from Porter we have seen together. Then we have something a bit more new, the hub monopoly. If we are in the case of mostly actually in IT and in consumer electronics, by in hub monopoly, in fact, the main idea is about setting some standards. You see that in the cases like Bluetooth, MP3, Wi-Fi, or other standards, then these standard setting, in fact, is done by some proprietary rights. And in those sectors, as the one I enumerated, like Bluetooth, MP3, and Wi-Fi, because there are standards, you cannot obstruct other people using it, but you're living from the licenses. And these licenses, because these licenses are somehow an obligation, and there is where the rights pooling is quite famous. So there are actually big patent pools, big IP pools, where all consumers have to use them, and they pay licenses, and the license fees are distributed due to the amount of patents you have in the pool. Uh, these sector is quite well established by having some IP holding organization. So even if at the beginning you might have some let's say some companies from other parts of technological companies. Normally they build an IP holding organization, and these IP holding organization is in fact in charge of licenses and the management of that licenses. So that is quite often the case, for example, for Sony, Philips, Siemens, for the cases I told you. Then, last but not least, in the examples I give you, is actually the monopoly in box. You might find it in sectors like biotechnology or consumer goods, and even maybe if the name is not that familiar to you, you have already seen some of the examples of it. And one of the most, let's say, non-examples in Monopoly in Box is the case of Intel. I'm sure if you are in front of your personal computer, if you look at your personal computer of your PC, you will see somehow it is written Intel Inside or Intel Core number 7 or so, whatever it is. So in fact, if we look thoroughly to that, it is nothing else but a component of that PC. Uh, in reality, nobody really cares that it is Intel Inside in it or not. But that is what we have by Monopoly in Box. By a well-defined portfolio and a good technology coverage and good enforceable rights, these companies bring it that even as components, they can bring their own trademark on a final product, which has in fact nothing to do with the with that component. Exactly the same case we have, for example, for some let's say components in bicycles and bikes. You have, for example, this Shimano effect. If it is a Shimano brake, or is it a Shimano let's say changing gears and so on. So all that for the end consumer is actually of non-importance. If it is Shimano or something else, you need actually a bike, and a bike shall have a brake. If it is Shimano or not is not important, but you know that most of the bicycles nowadays have these Shimano components, and you know the name of that component uh, besides any other thing. There's the same thing goes for Intel, as I gave you as an example. You know actually that the microprocessor is Intel, but do you know who, for example, who was producing other types like ICs and any other actually circuits you have in your personal computer? You don't know it. That is, in fact, the effect of monopoly in box. So uh, these are actually some just very usual generic IP strategies. One can actually think of a different type of maybe mixing of them, or any new types or other aspects which or other actually strategies I did not name here. Uh, but these are actually, again, a good hint uh, due to the industry you are in. You might be somehow obliged to go for the same strategy. Or if you want to demark yourself, if you want to be something special, then to find another way to be quite special inside that industry. But you have to be careful. You have to know what is the usual way of strategy and how to do it. Now, let's bring everything we said from the beginning up until now in one slide. So let's think of our business model. The business model is, in fact, puts the customer at the heart of it. And uh, what is it is your product which is at the heart of it. So that these product shall deliver some customer benefit for which actually the customer is willing to pay among other market, let's say, suppliers. So that is only done if you can differentiate yourself and you have a potential unique selling proposition. In order to create that customer benefit, you shall rely on your key resources, on your core competences as we defined it. And you have to create the value which is needed by your customer. And then around the whole, you shall try to put a barrier so that these customers cannot eventually take other offers coming from some, let's say, competitors. Here in these actually aspect, we see the both tools and the both aspects we saw before. The resource perspectives on the left side and the market perspectives on the right side. You have also a sort of temporal, let's say, distinction. You have the past, if you want, on the left side, and the future on the right side. You have also the aspects of income and cost. And the cost effect is what it costs you to produce that product, and once you sell it, in fact, that is actually the income effect where you get in. These income can only have a flow if you already invested it and you had some cost, and the cost is only justified if it brings to you some income. So all the aspects, even the IP, shall be seen under that point of view. I mean, if you patent a solution, for example, then it does not mean that you might sell more, let's say, of your product. The patent as itself, this property right, is a cost factor. So the cost you have to, let's say, apply for that patent, to write that patent, to write that patent, and also to enforce it, are all on the cost side. And these costs can only be justified if you have some income that justify that cost. So what shall you do? What shall you do? Then let's say the goal of your IP strategy is to exclusify. You want at the end to exclusify and make a sphere of exclusivity around, let's say, the unique selling proposition, and you have, in fact, to do that. Other than that, uh, the customer benefit can be offered by your competitors, and your customer will switch, maybe because it is cheaper, maybe because it is easier for him to do that. So these sphere of exclusivity is only created by strategic prohibition, and these strategic prohibition can only come from IP. So you have, for in order to do that, you have to know why your customer is willing to pay. You have to know the features which are important for your customer, for which the customer is ready to pay the money and he won't change it. And once you know what those features are, you can exclusify that features and make sure nobody else can afford to offer the same features. And that has nothing to do with patenting a technological solution. As I told you, your customer will not pay because you have a patent on that product. He will pay only because he needs it for some reason and for some features. So you see, in fact, where I'm coming to. What I want to say now is that patenting, let's say, a solution is something we did for the past 30, 40 years. And it is what I am telling people when I'm talking as a patent examiner that I am. But from the point of view of let's say, somebody who is running a company and so on, that is not the solution he needs for his IP strategy. What he needs for his IP strategy is, in fact, to know the features and to exclusify that features, not patenting the solution. But in order to know how these or where these, let's say, features are coming from, you shall be aware of where or how does the competitive advantage emerge. So normally, actually, it is not normally in an established, let's say, market situation. Um, all actors are clear. Those people are doing, let's say, these type of cars. These people are doing these type of cars, and everybody has its own role. Now, you want to be the one who emerge in that, let's say, established situation. That can happen through two possibilities. Either through the so-called external sources. So that might be that, in fact, um, uh, all of a sudden, people have changed their habitats, or the things have changed, or let's say the customer needs have changed. And when we are in the car situation, all of a sudden people are not willing to have the normal, let's say, the normal actually cars with benzene and other form of type of engines, but they want now, let's say, electro cars. So there is actually a change in the needs, and that is something that actually can happen. Uh, these actually leads to a resource heterogeneity, and in order to react to that, you need that adaptability of the firm to react, let's say, as fast as possible to that change. So that is actually the only way you might have or you might gain a competitive advantage. Example here, if you're in the car industry, that is the example of, for example, Tesla. Tesla is the company who understood, okay, there is actually a need on that, so I can emerge by adapt my, let's say, capacities or my capabilities to react to that change of need. Uh, uh, there is also another source where these competitive advantage may emerge. These are the internal sources. When you are talking about the internal sources, then these are changes that are driven by the company from inside out. That is when actually the company is imposing changes. Um, an example, the smartphone. In fact, everything about a smartphone was known, and even the patents are not really belonging to Apple. But in fact, Apple succeed by bringing iPhone 1 to the market to drive a change, and that is a change from internal source. So in that case, if you want to be in that situation, it needs, of course, a higher creativity and innovative potential of your firm. So only if you are in that situation, if you can be so innovative, uh, bring newer solution to the questions which is not there. That is because that is what we're talking about. You are driving a change for some needs which are not there. You are creating that need by the solution you are offering, and that is what happened with the smartphone as it came first to the market. So so what is in fact this competitive advantage, or what are different possibilities of having a competitive advantage? I said something like that before. I just want to reiterate what I said, that the competitive advantage can have only two forms. Either you have a cost advantage. So that means, in fact, uh, you are cheaper than other competitors. The cost advantage is more or less known, the ways how to achieve that cost advantage. And in order to have it, you might have the more efficient, let's say, production methods. You use our outsourcing, you reduce overhead cost, and make some, if you are talking about IP relevant matters, you might make some process innovation. Uh, uh, the effect that you might have by cost advantage, of course, you sell to cheaper prices, so you earn potentially less. But what you win is actually the market share. So the cost advantage might bring you the possibility of having more market share. Then uh, another and the only other possibility of a competitive advantage is a differentiation advantage. So uh, by differentiation advantages that actually you differentiate your product yourself from those of competitors. Here are the accents on more on branding, design, service quality, new products, innovation process, and of course, lot about advertisement. And all that aspects are very, very IP relevant because IP is at the basis of all of them. If it is about innovation, if it is about actually, let's say, branding, where you need a trademark for that, or even in the case of, let's say, advertisement. So the effect you will have by the differentiation advantage is what we call the premium price. So once you differentiate yourself from your competitors, you can ask higher prices. You ask for premium prices. So in the case of cost advantage, you have a similar product at lower cost. In the case of actual differentiation advantage, you have a premium price for a unique product, and that is it. There is no other way, in fact, to make a competitive advantage. So we can look at it from the strategic way, how to formulate that strategy. So, because what we did was at the beginning, we talk about different steps of the strategy. We started by making a strategic analysis. We talked about actually strategy objectives, and now we are coming to the strategy formulation, how to formulate your strategy. What we said is that once you have a business plan, the business plan will be at the beginning of the whole process of strategy formulation, because this business plan would define what would be the economic effect that you want to get. And we have seen it. The economic effect can be only two. One, having more market share, or two, having premium price. So there is no other way of having the economic effect. Now, going from this direction, coming from a business plan, we define the economic effect. Now, the next step is to define how to appropriate that economic effect. The appropriation of that economic effect is, for example, in the case of premium price, is, for example, unique selling proposition. Then, sorry, but the appropriation actually of that economic effect is, for example, by selling the product. So the impact that established that appropriation in the case of premium price is, of course, for example, the unique selling proposition. So that is the USP. And this impact will define the function of IP you need in order to assure that impact. So you are coming, in fact, from the business model over the economic effect to the appropriation, and then which defines the impact, and then actually this impact will define the function that is needed to create that impact. However, when you are inside a company, you will see the thing from the other side. So what you see is, in fact, that you see there is let's say, a function of an IP which creates the impact of, let's say, unique selling proposition, and that will be appropriated by selling pieces, and that make your economic effect. So most of the people are thinking maybe in that way. They start by defining the function that may put the impact and go to the appropriation, which is the wrong way of thinking. It comes like that if you do it the right way. Starting by your business model, the business model will define each of these aspects, which is, for example, premium price. Then you decide how to appropriate that premium price, what would be the impact that gives you this possibility, and that would, for example, in that case, in fact, bring it to the function you need. So, if you see on these chart, we can somehow distinguish between two parts. One part which includes function and impact, and the one part which includes appropriation and economic effect. In fact, the part IP administration is dealing with function and impact, and that is the part which, in fact, is dealing. Shall I renew the patent? Do I need to ask for the patent, and so on and so forth? That is actually the IP administration. And then you have actually the IP management part, which deals with appropriation and economic effect. So that is a sort of distinction we do between these two notions, which is IP management and IP administration. In a good case, you have the same, let's say, institution, the same person who is dealing with everything. So your IP needs to be, if I might bring the whole thing in one sentence, your IP need to be part of the decisions from the first moment. From where you decide what are the features of your product, what is your business plan, if you want. And only in that situation, if IP is involved in the whole process, you got the right strategy formulation that might bring you to success. So now come to the last part and give you a summary. And I want you to keep in mind the following points. First of all, a successful strategy is only possible if it is consistent with internal and external environment. You cannot just look at your internal forces. You cannot just look at your external market. You need to take into consideration both of them in order to be, let's say, successful. Don't forget, strategy is not a detailed plan. It is just a tool that coordinates, that supports your decision, and it is goal oriented. So it is always forward looking. So the strategy is there in order to give coherence to your acts and decisions, to acts and decisions of the whole unity. Then one thing you may take from this presentation, and that you have to keep in mind, is that IP strategy shall be derived from the business model. It cannot be the other way around. So we cannot try to make an IP and okay, let's make something successful out of it. It has only a value. This IP has only a value if it is somehow the part of the business strategy and the business model from the beginning. Another point which I want to mention is about how the strategy is defined. So you start with the strategy analysis. The strategy analysis is dealing with external and internal perspectives. So try to make your resources win. You remember the five the Porter forces, analyzing actually the market, increasing bargaining power through IP, and of course your business model. Then uh, you are dealing with the strategy objectives. Uh, that was how to position yourself in that let's say competitive environment. There you need actually some sort of SWOT, which is actually strength, weakness, opportunity, uh, and threat analysis, and of course you need to know the market attractivity regarding IP. And of course, you have to, let's say, adapt your resources in order to achieve the objectives of strategy. Then the last part is, in fact, IP strategy formulation, uh, which means actually how to develop that IP strategy in order to let's say have a competitive advantage which is sustainable, in how to create that sustainable competitive advantage.